back to the ongoing Targaryen history. The one we last left off was with the end of Viserys II, who had been an able ruler, having advised three kings before him and had the experience, but died shortly into his reign. It was his son, Aegon IV, or Aegon the Unworthy, that would succeed him. Jaime Lannister is quoted as saying, "Had Baelor closed his eyes and consummated his marriage, the realm would have been better off." This is not the last time history pivoted on such choice. Aegon had accompanied his cousin Daeron in the conquest of Dorne, and it was Aegon that was tasked with taking hostages back to King's Landing. One of his mistresses was Dana the Defiant, one of the brides of Baelor the Blessed, that was locked in the Maiden Vault. She gave birth to a son she named Daemon, who would become Daemon Blackfyre. He is generally considered one of the worst kings in Westeros history, earning himself the name Aegon the Unworthy. Considering this group includes Maegor the Cruel and the Mad King Aries, this is a pretty distinctive title for him to have earned himself. Aegon, during his reign, had a bunch of mistresses, many of whom bore him what would be known as the Great Bastards. Aegor Rivers, who was known as Bittersteel, was the founder of the Golden Company, and his mother was Barba Bracken. Brynden Rivers, who was known as Bloodraven, would later become the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and the last known wielder of the sword, Dark Sister. His mother was Melissa Blackwood. Another one of Aegon's great bastards was Shira Seastar, who was known as the most beautiful woman in the Seven Kingdoms. In the Riverland, there are a pair of hills that were disputed territories between the Brackens and the Blackwoods that were known as the Teats. When King Aegon took Barba Bracken to become his mistress and bore him Bittersteel, he renamed them Barba's Teats. A few years later, he casually appropriated the hills from the Brackens and gifted it to the Blackwoods, while renaming the hills for his new mistress, Melissa Blackwood, the mother of Bloodraven. The Blackwoods still call them Missy's Teats, and the Brackens call them Barba's Teats. Considering that Bittersteel was born from a Bracken mother and Bloodraven was born from a Blackwood mother, this would explain the animosity between the two half-brothers, as the two houses themselves had been feuding for centuries. Aegon was the brother of the Dragon Knight, Aemon Targaryen. Aegon the Unworthy was married to their sister Nerys, but treated her rather unkindly. Aemon was close to Nerys, and so a rift grew between the brothers. When she was accused of adultery, Aemon defended her honor in a trial by combat, and slew her accuser, Morgul Hastewick. Queen Nerys was the mother of Daeron Targaryen, who would become king. The accusation of infidelity would cast doubts on Daeron's parentage. It was rumored that Aegon had started these rumors himself to disinherit Daeron, as he was a foil to many of his father's plans. When one of Aegon's mistresses was caught cheating, he had them both executed, and had her father, Lord Bracken, executed out of spite. This led to an assassination attempt on the king, in which the Dragon Knight died to protect him, as was his duty as a member of the King's Guard. Aegon the Unworthy largely reminds me of that episode of Futurama where Bender turns into a human and is completely consumed by his own gluttony after he discovered how food and alcohol affected humans. Aegon the Unworthy was very similar, as he had an insatiable lust for all things involving the flesh, whether it be food or women. His bastard, Daemon, who was a fearsome knight and appeared every inch a Targaryen, unlike his half-brother Daeron. He was knighted at the age of 12 and was legitimized by Aegon and given the sword Blackfyre, for which he took the name. And in the Westeros tradition of bastards who reversed the color of their houses, Daemon Blackfyre took the sigil of a black three-headed dragon on scarlet. This began the talk of Daemon becoming king over Daeron, as Daeron appeared more Dornish than Targaryen. Dorne at this point was still a separate kingdom from Westeros that had not been knitted into the realm, and Aegon wanted to conquer Dorne, something that Daeron was opposed to. His first attempt to conquer Dorne was to send a massive fleet to the Dornish coast, but the fleet was scattered and destroyed en route. He later made a second attempt. Since dragons were all dead, he had ordered his pyromancers to, quote, build me a dragon. The result was a large and unstable wood and iron monstrosities that shot jets of wildfire. There were 7 made that were sent down to Dorne, but they didn't make it that far, and because of their instability, they all burned down along with a quarter of the King's Wood. Aegon never brought up Dorne again, following such a massive humiliation. This is another one of those kings that has numerous details that are probably left to other banners, including House Blackfyre, Bittersteel, and Bloodraven, both of whom have personal banners of their own. At the time of his death, he was so grotesquely fat that there were fleshworms crawling around in his skin, and he couldn't even get up from his couch and was covered in his own excrement. Perhaps in a move that was done purely out of spite, he legitimized all of his bastards on his deathbed, and this would cause massive bloodletting and a headache for generations to come in Westeros. His son, Daeron II, or Daeron the Good, succeeded him and had to face the first Blackfyre Rebellion. In 184 AC, Daeron ascended to the throne and became one of the better Targaryen kings. This is evident as he earned the moniker Daeron the Good. He wore the crown of his father, a huge red gold crown with dragon heads for points. This would be worn by both Aries I and Aries II. He was married to Maria Martell of Dorne. This had been arranged by Vale the Blessed as a peace pact between the two kingdoms. Daeron quickly placed men of his own choosing to the small council, and it took a year to fix the corruption of the city watch that had occurred during his father Aegon the Unworthy's reign. And it was during Daeron's reign that the kingdom of Dorne was finally knit into the realm. After 2 years of negotiations, Meryn Martell, the Prince of Dorne, and Daeron's sister, Princess Daenerys, wed in 188 AC. A year later, the prince swore an oath of fealty to the crown. They placed a golden wreath at the statue of Vale the Blessed at the Great Sept of Baelor to seal the pact. To celebrate the peace, Daeron had a summer hall built in the Dornish marshes. This was a lightly fortified palace that had acted as a sort of royal getaway for the Targaryens. As part of the pact, the Dornish were allowed to keep the title of prince and were granted other favors that weren't bestowed on other noble houses in Westeros, which angered many of the greater houses as Daeron was seen favoring Dorne over the rest of them. Daeron had 2 sons that were both able knights, and these were Baelor Breakspear and Maegor Targaryen, both of whom would face each other in combat. The First Blackfyre Rebellion took root largely because of Daemon's coziness with Dorne. Many in Westeros still hated the Dornish and disliked the peaceful ties that Daeron had with House Martell. One of these Blackfyre supporters was Eustace Osgrey, who would later be featured in the Duncan the Tall story, The Sworn Sword. Daemon's half-brother, Aegor Rivers, aka Bittersteel, encouraged Daemon to claim the throne for himself. The rebels who sided with the Blackfyres used the claims of Daeron's illegitimacy to stoke the rebellion. The rebellion broke out in battles in the Riverlands, the Reach, the Vale, and the Westerlands, between the supporters of the Black Dragon and the loyalists of the Red Dragon. Daeron Targaryen was supported by his half-brother Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven. As you may recall, the two bastards came from mothers of feuding houses, Bittersteel from Brackens and Bloodraven from the Blackwoods. The First Rebellion ended at the Battle of Redgrass Field in 196 AC, with the death of Daemon and his two eldest sons, Aegon and Aemon Blackfyre. Bittersteel escaped and fled across the narrow sea, with Daemon's surviving sons. Essos is where Bittersteel would form the Golden Company. After the rebellion, the supporters of the Black Dragon had lands, castles, and hostages taken as punishment. Daeron's son Baelor Breakspear was the heir to the throne and served as hand to the king. Many saw him as an able and suitable successor to his father. However, at the tourney at Ashford in 209, Baelor was accidentally slain by his brother Maegor during a trial of 7. The trial involved the accused hedge knight Duncan the Tall, and this trial serves as the basis for the short story, The Hedge Knight. King Daeron died the following year in the Great Spring Sickness, along with 2 of his grandchildren, Princes Valar and Materys. He was succeeded by his son, Aries I. He had reigned for 25 years, and most of these years saw peace and plenty for the realm. Unlike his brothers Baelor Breakspear and Maegor Targaryen, who were knights of renown, Aries was more bookish. People spoke that Aries would rather take a book to bed than his own wife. Aries married his cousin, Lady Aelinor Penrose, but never got her with child. It was rumored that the marriage was never even consummated. Aries was more interested in books than in ruling, and he had named his uncle Bloodraven Hand of the King, and let him rule while he spent his days studying books and lore. The Great Spring Sickness took place during his reign, and followed by a severe drought that lasted over a year. His reign was more troubled than his father's. In 212 AC, Lord Dagon Greyjoy raided Fair Isle, the Arbor in the north, and at the same time, Lord Gorman Peak, a Blackfyre loyalist, brought Daemon II across from the Narrow Sea. And during the White Walls tourney, they were to start the Second Blackfyre Rebellion, but were thwarted by Bloodraven's spies and by Sir Duncan the Tall. And unlike the First Blackfyre Rebellion, the second one ended with little bloodshed. The Third Blackfyre Rebellion started in 219 AC and ended with the capture of Bittersteel and the death of Aegon Blackfyre, who was another son of Daemon Blackfyre. Bittersteel was brought to King's Landing in chains. Bloodraven and Prince Arion wanted him put to death, but King Aries sentenced him to take the black instead. Bittersteel would manage to escape and never took the black. Without any children of his own, Aries recognized 4 different heirs during his reign. The first 3 died before succeeding him, and it was his younger brother Maekar, the one who accidentally slew his older brother Baelor Breakspear, who succeeded him. Maekar I became king in 221 AC. He wore a warlike crown of black iron points on a band of red gold. This replaced the more ornate crowns that had been worn by Targaryen kings, and had replaced the one that had been lost by King Daeron, the young dragon, when he died during the first conquest of Dorne, which had originally been worn by Aegon the Conqueror. Maekar I was powerfully built, and quick to judge and condemn. Unlike his brother Baelor, he lacked charisma and did not make friends or allies easily. After Baelor's death, he became even more unforgiving. Maekar had fought as commander during the first Blackfyre Rebellion. It was his shield wall that held against Bittersteel in the Battle of the Redgrass Field. His brother, Baelor, attacked with a host from the rear. A song about the hammer and the anvil was made about the battle, Baelor being the hammer and Maekar being the anvil. Being the 4th-born son, Maekar felt overshadowed by his siblings. Due to the large number of heirs, his 3rd son Aemon was sent to the Citadel to become a maester. This is actually the same Aemon that appears in the Song of Ice and Fire series at the Wall. Maekar went to the tourney at Ashford Meadows to watch his sons Daeron and Arion compete, and his 4th son Aegon to squire for Daeron. Daeron got drunk before reaching the tournament, and during the joust, Arion killed his opponent's horse on purpose, and Aegon became a squire for Duncan the Tall instead. When Prince Arion was attacked by Duncan the Tall, who came to the defense of a puppeteer, Arion demanded a trial by combat, to which Maekar came to his support. As stated earlier, Maekar killed his brother Baelor during the Trial of 7. Afterwards, Arion was banished to the Free Cities, and Aegon was allowed to squire for Duncan the Tall. Maekar took the throne in 221 AC, and kept his uncle Bloodraven on as Hand of the King. Maekar's son Daeron died supposedly of a pox that he had caught from a whore, and his second oldest son, Arion, died after drinking wildfire, thinking it would turn him into a dragon. Maekar reigned for 12 years, until 233 AC. He died in a battle fighting rebellious Lord during the Peak Uprising. He was succeeded by Aegon V, or Aegon the Unlikely. Aegon the Unlikely got the name being the 4th-born son to his father Maekar, who was also a 4th-born son. Aegon was known in his younger years as Egg, and served as Duncan the Tall's squire. He is one of the main characters in the Dunk and Egg stories that take place about 100 years before the start of A Song of Ice and Fire. Aegon became king after a great council was convened to determine succession. His older brother Aemon, who had become a maester, abdicated the throne. During most of his reign, his friend Duncan the Tall served as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Aegon's first act as king was to arrest Bloodraven for the murder of Aenys Blackfyre. Bloodraven had guaranteed Aenys safe passage to the Great Council, but had him executed when he arrived in King's Landing. Although people were glad to see one less Blackfyre pretender around, Aegon knew that he had to punish Bloodraven, otherwise the word of the Iron Throne might not mean anything. Aegon sentenced Bloodraven to death, but he allowed Bloodraven to take the black. Aegon's brother, Maester Aemon, joined the Night's Watch at the same time, and Bloodraven took his personal guard, the Raven's Teeth, with him. Aegon reigned during a harsh winter between 230 and 236. Aegon shipped food to the north, and was generally benevolent to the small folk, having grown up amongst them. The end of the long winter saw the return of the Blackfyre pretenders. In 236, Daemon III attempted to seize the Iron Throne with the Golden Company, but few rallied to his side. Duncan the Tall slew Daemon in single combat, and once again, Bittersteel escaped with the Golden Company across the narrow sea. There were many uprisings during Aegon's reign. At one point, he had to intervene in the Westerlands because of the ineptitude of Tytos Lannister of Casterly Rock. This was the father of Tywin Lannister. Having grown up among the small folk, Aegon had a distaste for incest, and Aegon betrothed his children to great houses in the realm. His oldest son, Prince Duncan, chose to abdicate the throne when he chose the peasant girl Jenny of Oldstones over his betrothal to daughter of Lord Lionel Baratheon. Lord Baratheon rose in rebellion at the refusal, and it ended when Sir Duncan the Tall forced him to yield during a trial by combat. Aegon's second oldest son, Jaehaerys, was betrothed to Celia Tully, but he secretly wed his sister Shaera and consummated the marriage in 240. Shaera had been betrothed to House Tyrell. Aegon was left to deal with the anger of House Tully and House Tyrell. His third son, Daeron, was betrothed to Olenna Redwyn, but Daeron preferred the company of Sir Jeremy Norridge. They both perished in battle in 251, crushing a rebellion led by the Rat, the Hawk, and the Pig. Olenna Redwyn would later be known as Olenna Tyrell, aka the Queen of Thorns, who is the grandmother of Sir Loras and Marjorie Tyrell. During Aegon's reign, the Band of Nine, an outfit of outlaws, pirates, and exiles, including Maelys Blackfyre, hoped to carve out individual kingdoms in the disputed lands in Essos. Aegon left this trouble alone, as he had his own problems to deal with in Westeros. Because of the numerous uprisings during his reign, Aegon was convinced that it was the lack of dragons that was preventing his decrees from taking hold. Aegon attempted to hatch dragons at Summerhall in 259. While the events of what transpired are unclear, the little that is known indicate that wildfire was used in an attempt to hatch the eggs. Aegon, along with his lifelong friend, Sir Duncan the Tall, died in the tragedy. His second son, Aries II, would succeed him. Many of the laws and decrees that were granted to the small folk during his reign would later be undone by Tyrion Lannister, the Hand of the Mad King. Aeries II became king in 259 AC. He was sickly looking, pale, and frail, much like the conqueror's son, Aenys I. His reign, much like Aenys' reign, would also be a short one. Aeris wore the crown of his grandfather Maegor, the warlike crown of black pointed iron. His parents did everything they could to keep Aeris and his sister Shaera away from each other, but that just seemed to make things worse, and they wed in secret and consummated their marriage almost immediately. The last Blackfire pretender, Meleys the Monstrous, died during his reign in 259, during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. At this point, the Band of Nine had taken over the Stepstones, which was the islands in between the disputed lands and Dorne, which was also known as the Broken Arm of Dorne, and it was feared that they meant to launch an attack on Westeros from there. Meleys was named so because of his massive size and the small head of his twin growing out of his neck that he had absorbed in the womb. He would be slain by Sir Barristan Selmy, or Barristan Bold, during combat. Aerys died at the age of 37 after a short illness. His oldest son, Aries, would be the last of the Targaryen kings. This meant that Aerys was the grandfather of Daenerys Stormborn, mother of dragons. And at last we come to Aries II, also known as the Mad King, and to a lesser extent, King Scab. He ruled Westeros for 21 years, to the age of 39. I actually had to look that up, since all the depictions of him are of this old, crusty king that let his hygiene go completely to waste. But no, he was born in 244 AC and died in 283 AC. He was born to Aeris II and his sister wife, Princess Shaera. He was the grandson of Aegon the Unlikely, or Egg. He was married to his sister, Rhaella, while still a teenager. His grandfather, Aegon, was against it, but his father allowed it. The reason for allowing it was because of a prophecy made by a woods witch that had been interpreted that the prince that was promised would be born of the line of Aries and Rhaella. This was the same woods witch that was friends with Jenny of Old Stones. According to Barristan Selmy, who was present at their wedding, the two siblings weren't fond of each other, and it turned out to be an unhappy marriage. As a youth, Aries befriended Tywin Lannister, who at the time was a page at the royal court, and Steffon Baratheon, his cousin, and the three became inseparable. The three of them had fought together in the Stepstones during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. His wife gave birth to to their firstborn son Rhaegar during the tragedy of Summerhall. Afterward, his father ascended to the throne. It's rumored, on the night of Jaehaerys' coronation, that Aerys took the maidenhead of Joanna Lannister, who had came to court for the celebration. There was a more reliable rumor that Aerys took liberties during Joanna's bedding ceremony, much to Tywin's displeasure. She was dismissed by Queen Rhaella shortly thereafter. Aerys received his knighthood at the age of 16, fighting on the Stepstones. He served as a squire during the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and 2 years later, after his father died of a sudden illness, he ascended to the throne. Aerys wore the crown of Aegon the Unworthy and Darren the Good, a large crown of red gold, each point a dragon's head. He was a charming man in his youth, and was active and lively during the early part of his reign. He enjoyed music, dancing, masked balls, and young women. He was not super intelligent, and was very temperamental. When he was crowned, he declared that it was his wish to be the greatest king the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen. His friends, who were lickspittles and suck-ups, suggested that he would be remembered as Aries the Wise, or Aries the Great. When he took over the crown, the royal court was filled with men who dated back to the court of Aegon V. He replaced many of the old men of his father's court with new blood, including his childhood friend, Tyrion Lannister. He had been impressed by the way he put down the Rain Tarbeck revolt in the Westerlands, the deeds of which inspired the song, The Rains of Castamere. At 20 years old, Tywin had been named Hand of the King, the youngest hand in history. Aerys had boasted of many grandiose plans early in his reign, including building a second wall hundreds of miles north of the current wall and claim all the lands in between. He wanted to build a city of white marble on the southern banks of the Blackwater Rush after complaining about the smell of King's Landing. He wanted to build a fleet to, quote, bring the Titan to its knees after a dispute with the Iron Bank. He wanted to build large aqueducts in Dorne, promising to, quote, make the deserts bloom. Other plans included invading the Stepstones and adding them to the Westeros kingdom. He would quickly lose interest in these plans and abandon them completely. The kingdom prospered under King Aerys, although it was more due to the efforts of his hand, Tywin. The dispute with the Iron Bank was settled when Tywin paid back the debts with gold from Casterly Rock. Tywin also pleased the High Lords by revoking many of the laws and rights that were granted to them by Aegon the Unlikely. Tywin reduced tariffs, which increased trade between the free cities. He brought about stern punishments, held lavish tournaments, and built and repaired roads. In his ruling, he was aided by Grand Maester Pycelle. Tywin wasn't well liked, but his effectiveness as hand was widely known, and it was rumored that Tywin, not Aerys, was the true ruler of the realm. This eventually irked Aerys, and he'd soon start to turn against his once best friend. Aerys is rumored to have had as many mistresses as Aegon the Unworthy, which seems unlikely. Aries would lose interest in them within a moon's turn. Queen Rhaella turned a blind eye to these infidelities, but took offense to Aries sleeping his way through the ladies in her court. Their relationship worsened when she was unable to bear him more children. Several miscarriages and stillborns followed one another. Aries became suspicious that the queen was unfaithful. He declared that none of the stillborns were his, forbid the queen to leave Maegor's holdfast, and made 2 septas share her bed each night. When Tywin's father Tytos died in 267 AC, Aries accompanied him to Casterly Rock, bringing the 8-year-old Rhaegar with him to attend the funeral. When the court returned to King's Landing, the relationship between king and hand was beginning to unravel. Aries began to ignore his hand's advice and even overturned his decisions. When the king doubled and tripled port fees at many of the harbor towns, he blamed it on Tywin, only to restore them and make his hand look bad. By 270 AC, the king was aware that most people considered Tywin the true ruler of Westeros, and the king was determined to, quote, put him in his place. In 272, at a tourney celebrating the 10th anniversary of Aerys' rule, Joanna brought her 6-year-old twins to court. Aerys, while very drunk, asked if breastfeeding her kids had ruined her teats. Following the humiliation, Tywin attempted to resign, but the king refused. By this point, the king was constantly mocking and jabbing his hand, and Tywin took it all in stride. Those close to the king would often mock Tywin to gain his favor. The following year is when Joanna gave birth to Tyrion Lannister. There is a theory that Aerys got her with child when she was visiting for the anniversary tourney, and that Tyrion is actually half Targaryen. I have a theory that those of Valyrian descent have trouble conceiving with other non-Valyrian humans. If this theory is true, it may account for Tyrion's hair being a mix of gold with platinum streaks, mismatched eyes, and a misshapen body. It may also explain Tywin's undying hatred for Tyrion, as he may believe that Tyrion is not really his son. Joanna died giving birth to Tyrion, so that may also explain Tywin's hatred for him. Aerys commented that the monstrous babe and the death of his wife was the result of the gods teaching his hand some humility. That will do it for part 6 of the Targaryen banner and history of the kings of Westeros. I have one more final video to put out, and quite a bit more history about Aerys Targaryen and the fall of the Targaryen dynasty. I promise it will take me less time to put out the next video than it did to put out this one. So please join me for the final installment of House Targaryen, of Dragonstone and the Crownlands of Westeros.